What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is January 3rd, 2026, about 3:25 p.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our 17th book in our Books React series. This is episode 14 of A History of Psychology, written by the mysterious Professor Thomas Hardy Leahey. Shout out to my guy Kamal in the chat. He says, great minds think alike, comrade. Chains and pound signs to you. Shout out to my guy Kamal, leader of the Defense from Crackerdom League. Holla at him if you want to get your application in and your gear mailed out to you. It's a sad day right now. For me as an American, my country is continuing its long tradition of violating international law and human rights by kidnapping the democratically elected president of a sovereign nation, that nation being Venezuela. Fuck the United States of America, that bloodthirsty great Satan. I have a deep sadness in my heart right now that is hard to even describe, that's hard to even put into words, because every single year I see my country continue to fall deeper and deeper into the depths of the abyss of depravity. Every single year, I continue to see my country become more wicked, evil, and a torrential force of terrorism against the people of the planet Earth. And there's nothing we could do to sort of stop it. It's so sad. It's so disheartening. I could talk about it for hours. We'll probably do a call-in show after we do this live stream. What we will be doing today, though, as we continue to try to educate the people, is finish Chapter 6 of A History of Psychology. We have about 20 pages left of it to go, and we're going to pick up right here on Immanuel Kant and his contributions to scientific psychology. Given Kant's disdain for Hume's psychological account of knowledge, Kant cared little for psychology. Kant believed that psychology, defined as the introspective study of the mind, could not be a science for two reasons. First, he did not think that enough aspects of consciousness could be measured quantitatively to make possible Newtonian equations about the mind. Second, according to Kant, any science has two parts, the empirical part involving observation and research, and the rational or metaphysical part comprising the philosophical foundations that justify the empirical science's claim to produce knowledge. Kant believed that he had provided the metaphysical grounding of physical science in his account of human experience, the Critique of Pure Reason. There he showed that the basic assumptions of physics, such as universal causality, were necessarily true of human experience. Hence, physics is a complete science. Going to the comments, Kamal says, what do you think of the boat strikes? The boat strikes are crimes against humanity. The boat strikes are actual murder. If you ever want to see a state, if you ever want to see a country actually do criminal activity, watch the numerous videos of the boat strikes off the coast of Venezuela and Trinidad done by the United States of America. That is wicked. It is evil. It is why America is a wicked, evil, depraved nation. That's what I think about the boat strikes. What do you think about the boat strikes? Autistic Cool, put your comments in the chat. Kant argued, however, that rational psychology is an illusion. The object of rational psychology is the thinking substance or soul. Descartes' I think. Therefore, we do not experience the soul, the transcendental ego, directly. It has no content, being pure thought. It has only noumenal, not phenomenal existence. In Lockean terms, Kant asserted that there is no introspective power of reflection because the self cannot observe its own thought. There is an empirical ego, of course, the sum total of our sensations or mental content, and we can study it through introspection. However, this empirical psychology, unlike empirical physics, cannot be a science because it lacked its rational counterpart. Kant thought little of it. Nevertheless, Kant believed in a science, or at least a discipline, concerned with humanity. He called it anthropology, the study, logos, of humans, anthropos. Kant's anthropology was psychology, not modern anthropology, being the study of human intellectual faculties, human appetite, and human character, not the cross-cultural study of societies. Kant delivered a very popular series of lectures published as Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View in 1798. If Kant's philosophy is similar to Reid's, his anthropology is similar to Stewart's psychology, complete with an enumeration of faculties. Kant's lectures are accessible, full of shrewd observations of everyday behavior, charming and even funny anecdotes, and popular prejudice. In short, anthropology is Kant's common sense psychology and bears some attention. When he says popular prejudice, he's probably talking about racism, because Kant was a well-known anti-black racist. So his popular prejudice was probably saying things like the Negro is naturally dumb. Continuing, Kant distinguished physiological anthropology concerned with the body and its effect on mind, and pragmatic anthropology concerned with the person as a morally free agent and citizen of the world. Wundt's later division of psychology into physiological and social branches was like Kant's division of anthropology. The goal of pragmatic anthropology was to improve human behavior, and so was grounded not in the metaphysics of experience, but in the metaphysics of morals. Pragmatic anthropology's methods were many. We have some introspective knowledge of our own minds and, by extension, of other minds. Kant was aware of the pitfalls of introspection, however. When we introspect, we change the state of our minds, so what we find is unnatural and of limited value. The same holds for trying to observe our own behavior. Kant even went so far as to say that excessive reflection on one's own mind may drive one insane. Similarly, when we observe others, they will act unnaturally if they know we are watching. Anthropology must be an interdisciplinary study embracing these methods, but using them with care, and also calling on history, biography, and literature for information about human nature. Anthropology is a rich work. Kant discusses everything from insanity, which he felt was innate, to the nature of women, they are weaker but more civilized than men, and how to give a dinner party for philosophers. Just one of Kant's many topics will be presented here. However, for it occurs in Wundt's psychology in much the same form. Kant discussed ideas that we have without being aware of them. If we examine our awareness, we will find that some perceptions are clear, the ones we are attending to, while others are obscure. As Kant put it, our mind is like an immense map, with only a few places illuminated. This view of consciousness as a field with clear and obscure areas is identical to Wundt's. The obscure ideas are those we are not clearly aware of. So obviously, Kant's doctrine is not Freud's view of repression into the unconscious. However, Kant does say we can be subtly affected by obscure ideas. He observes that we often unthinkingly judge persons by the clothes they wear, without being conscious of the connection between the clothes and our feelings for the wearer. Kant also offers pragmatic advice to writers. Make your ideas a little obscure so that when a reader clarifies them, you will make him or her feel clever. In addition to his conception of consciousness, many of Kant's other ideas influenced Wundt, the founder of psychology of consciousness. By Wundt's time, ways to experiment on and quantify mind had become available, and so Wundt was able to show that a scientific empirical psychology was possible without a rational companion. Wundt thus could abandon the transcendental ego altogether. However, it still lived in Wundt's system in modified form. Wundt emphasized how apperception gives unity to conscious experience, a role Kant assigned to the transcendental ego. In addition, Wundt put thinking beyond the reach of introspection, as did Kant, holding that it could be investigated only indirectly through a study of people in society, similar to Kant's anthropology. Wundt's psychology had two parts: the laboratory study of experience via introspection, Kant's empirical psychology made into a science despite him, and the study of the higher mental processes via the comparative study of culture, similar to Kant's anthropology, although Wundt did not use the label. Wundt also modified Kant's view of introspection. Wundt said good scientific introspection was not the intense scrutiny of the soul, which Kant found dangerous, but only the self-observations of one's experience, which even Kant said was possible. The moral question: is society natural? It has seemed to me that one must treat ethics like all the other sciences and construct experimental ethics in the same way as experimental physics, wrote the philosophe Claude Helvetius in De l'Esprit in 1758. Here is the heart of the Enlightenment project, finding the ideal human way of life by scientific research and constructing it by applied scientific technology. However, constructing experimental ethics proved more daunting and more perilous than experimental physics. Hobbes had approached human nature in the scientific spirit and found that humans were vicious and dangerous creatures, apt to be at each other's throats without the stern control of an authoritarian government. Thinkers of the French Enlightenment undertook their project in an optimistic spirit of improving everyone's life through science, but ended up in their revolution apparently confirming Hobbes's pessimism. As scientific epistemology eventually resulted in a skeptical crisis, so scientific ethics resulted in a moral crisis. In Scotland, the common sense philosophers resisted the moral crisis in ways that were especially important to American thought. Moreover, a reaction against the Enlightenment began to set in at the very time Helvetius wrote De l'Esprit. Changing the lighting here. This is better. Experimental ethics, French naturalism. In France, the Enlightenment project was pursued more radically and ruthlessly than in Britain. There were two major sources for the philosophes' naturalism. One was John Locke's empirical psychology. In 18th century France, there was a mania for things English, especially Newton's science and Locke's psychology. The supreme philosophe, Voltaire, wrote in his philosophical lecture, "So many philosophers having written the romance of the soul, a sage has arrived who has modestly written its history." Locke sets forth human reason just as an excellent anatomist explains the parts of the human body. He everywhere takes the light of Newton's physics for his guide. The other source of naturalism was native to France, Descartes' mechanistic physiology. Cartesian materialism. Immediately after Descartes proposed that animals are simply machines, but humans are not machines, and so escape science by virtue of having souls, many of his religious opponents saw the trap he had unwittingly set. For if animals, which behave in such diverse and often sophisticated ways, are but machines, is not the next logical step to say that a person too is but a machine? They believed that Descartes was a secret materialist who only intimated what he hoped others might later say openly. Defenders of religion and these things to ridicule Descartes' system as subversive of faith. But in the irreligious 18th century, there were those who said them in earnest, proclaiming materialism. Although there were materialists since the Greek atomist, they were few and silent during the Middle Ages. However, in the Age of Reason, their numbers multiplied, and they became more open and vocal. They spoke up first in anonymous pamphlets, fearing persecution, but they soon grew bolder. The most outspoken and complete extension of Descartes' beast machine into the human machine was made by the physician-philosopher Julien Offray de la Mettrie, born 1709 and died in 1751, whose major work was L'Homme Machine, or Man, a Machine, published in 1748. Interestingly, La Mettrie, too, thought Descartes was a secret materialist, but he praised Descartes for it. La Mettrie wrote, "He was the first to prove completely animals are pure machines, a discovery of such importance that one must pardon all his errors." La Mettrie took the step feared by religionists. Let us boldly conclude that man is a machine, that the soul is but an empty word. As a physician, La Mettrie held that only a physician may speak on human nature, for only a physician knows that mechanism of the body. La Mettrie went into some detail to show how the state of the body affects the mind, for example, in the effects of drugs, disease, and fatigue. Against Descartes' insistence on the uniqueness of human language, La Mettrie suggested that apes might be made into little gentlemen by teaching them language the way the deaf are taught. La Mettrie remained a Cartesian, however, in asserting that language is what makes a person human. He denied only that language is innate, claiming that we can make the ape human too via language. In general, Lamettrie gives the impression not of lowering humans to the level of animals, but of raising animals to near human status. This intent emerges most clearly in his discussion of raising animals to near. Sorry, I messed up that sentence. my bad. In general, Lamettrie gives the impression not of lowering humans to the level of animals, but of raising animals to near human status. This intent emerges most clearly in his discussion of natural moral law. Lamettrie argued that animals share with humans moral sentiments such as grief and regret, so that morality is inherent in the natural biological order. Having said this, however, Lamettrie left the door open to sheer hedonism by stating that the point of living is to be happy. Lamettrie adopted an uncompromisingly scientific, anti-theological attitude to his subject. He denied finalism or any godly act of intentional creation. For example, the animal eye was not created by God to make seeing possible, but arose by evolution because seeing was important to creatures' biological survival. Lamettrie here stated a doctrine called transformism, which was increasingly popular in the later 18th century, and which marks the beginning of evolutionary thought. According to transformism, the universe was not created by God, but emerged from primordial matter as a result of the action of natural law. The development of the physical and, Lamettrie implied, biological universe is a necessary consequence of the way nature is organized. Voltaire's creator is no more necessary than the Christian God. Voltaire's creator is no more necessary than the Christian God. When it came to discussing living creatures, Lamettrie returned to the view of the Renaissance nature philosophers Descartes had rejected and attributed special powers to living matter. He thought biological tissue to be capable, at least, of self-generation and motion. Lamettrie cited contemporary physiological research to prove his points. Polyps cut in two regenerate their missing halves. Muscles of dead animals still move when stimulated. The heart can beat after removal from the body. Matter is alive, it is vital, not dead. And it is precisely this natural vitality that made Lamettrie's human machine plausible. In the 20th century, vitalism became the great enemy of scientific biologists, but it was an important step in the founding of biology as a coherent field apart from physics. Lamettrie's vitalism again attests that his materialism was not meant to degrade humanity, to make of a human being a cold metallic machine, the image we have today of the machine, but rather to make of a human a vital, living, dynamic machine, an integral part of a living nature. Descartes' human being, like Plato's in Christianity's, was torn between nature and heaven. Lamettrie's was simply part of nature. We should conclude this summary as Lamettrie did his book. Like a good philosopher and like B.F. Skinner much later, Lamettrie urged the progressive nature and moral goodness of accepting materialism, of giving up vain speculation and religious superstition to live pleasurable lives. Recognizing ourselves to be part of nature, we can then revere, honor, and never destroy nature. Our behavior towards others will improve, wrote Lamettrie in 1748. Full of humanity, we will love human character even in our enemies. In our eyes, they will be but mismade men. We will not mistreat our kind. Following the natural law given to all animals, we will not wish to do to others what we would not wish them do to us. Such is my system, or rather the truth, unless I am much deceived. It is short and simple. Dispute it now who will. With this passage, Lamettrie closed L'Homme Machine, or Man, a Machine. Although his truth was not acceptable to all philosophers in its extreme form, and Christians hotly disputed it, materialism was a growing doctrine. It was reluctantly and partially accepted by Voltaire himself and by Denis Diderot, conceiver of the Encyclopedia, and espoused in extreme form by Baron Paul de Holbach, who lived from 1723 and died in 1789. Baron Paul Holbach worked out its deterministic and atheistic implications. We will see its link to the moral crisis shortly. Moving on to French empiricism. The other route to naturalism was through Locke's empiricism, which inspired France's soi-disant, Newton's of the mind. The general tendency of their thought was toward sensationism, deriving the mind entirely from sensations, denying the existence of autonomous mental faculties and the power of reflection found in Locke's psychology. The French commentators thought they were purifying and improving Locke's philosophy. The first important French Lockean was Etienne Bonnot de Condillac, who lived from 1715 and died in 1780. Condillac dismissed everyone but Locke. Immediately after Aristotle comes Locke. And that's funny. I like that quote. I like that. Condillac dismissed everyone but Locke. Immediately after Aristotle comes Locke. And to his first book, an essay on the origin of human knowledge, published in 1746. He gave the subtle being a supplement to Mr. Locke's essay on human understanding. Like Berkeley, Condillac believed Locke had not pursued his own empiricism far enough, but in his essay he followed Locke closely. Only in a later work, Treatise on Sensations, published in 1754, did Condillac really fulfill his earlier promise to reduce to a single principle whatever relates to the human understanding. That principle is sensation. Locke had allowed the mind certain autonomous powers, the power of reflection on itself in mental faculties or acts, such as attention and memory. Condillac strove to see the mind in a more purely empiricist way. He denied the existence of reflection and tried to derive all mental faculties from simple sensation. His motto might have been, "I sense, therefore I am." Condillac asked his readers to imagine a statue that is endowed with each sense in turn, starting with smell. Condillac then endeavored to build up complex mental activity from these senses. For example, memory arises when a sensation is experienced for a second time and recognized. We should observe that here Condillac cheated, for he assumed an inner power or faculty to store the first sensation, an innate power indistinguishable from memory. Attention is reduced to the strength of one sensation to dominate in the mind other weaker sensations. In his essay, Condillac had followed Locke and said attention was a mental act, as Will Wundt a century later. But in the treatise, his sensationism is consistent, and he anticipates Titchener's identical sensationist revision of Wundt's theory. In short, Condillac attempted to work out an empiricist theory of mind. However, on one point, he remained a good Cartesian. At the end of Condillac's thought experiment about the statue, although it had acquired every mental faculty and every human sense, the statue still lacked the essential Cartesian human trait. It could not speak. Condillac said, with Descartes, that it could not speak because it lacked a reason. Its mind was passive, not active. It lacked the power of thought. In Condillac's scheme, as in Descartes', the statue and animals are set off from human beings. Condillac simplified the emerging picture of the animal soul, showing how it might be built up without the innate faculties that had been attributed to it since the time of Aristotle. He left the human soul as Descartes had left it, as the power to think. Condillac, a Christian, left the stripping of human beings of their soul, the seat of reason, to more radical men who were more willing to embrace La Mettrie's materialism and to work out its consequences. Continuing here with consequences of French materialism and empiricism. One of these more radical thinkers was Claude Helvetius, born 1715 and died in 1771. Helvetius accepted Condillac's empiricism and a mechanical version of La Mettrie's materialism. Following Locke's statement that the infant mind was white paper or wax to be molded and fashioned as one pleases, Helvetius proclaimed a complete environmentalism, in which humans have neither a divine soul nor a complex biological structure. The human possesses only senses, a passive mind able to receive sensations, and a body capable of certain actions. This mind is passively built up through watching the effects of a person's own and others' actions and observing the ways of the world. For Helvetius, then, the mind at birth is both blank and powerless. Everything a person becomes is the result of the environment. Helvetius found cause for optimism in the malleability of the mind, holding out the hope that improved education would lead to improved people. In this tenet, he presaged the radical behaviorists who believe human behavior is similarly malleable. Such beliefs, however, have a negative potential as well. An effective dictatorship can be founded on brainwashing. Such beliefs, however, have a negative potential as well. An effective dictatorship can be founded on brainwashing. We now come to the moral crisis created by the Enlightenment project. Is it possible to have scientific ethics as Helvetius hoped? With few exceptions in the history of the West up to this time, including Descartes, Locke, and Kant, reason had been assigned the job of imposing moral behavior on humans' natural tendencies toward pleasure. Ironically, however, in the age of reason, the scope of reason had been reduced and belief in a transcendent moral order, whether Platonic, Stoic, or Christian, had been shattered. All that remained was human nature as a guide to right and wrong. The problem was finding good in human nature. La Mettrie said pleasure is a natural cause for our existence. Nature made us to pursue pleasure. Condillac, too, reduced reason to desire or need. If each sensation produces pleasure or pain, then our thinking, built up out of our sensations by association, is determined by their effective quality and directed by our momentary animal needs. Hence, empiricism undercuts the autonomy of reason. For the rationalist, reason is prior to and independent of sensation. So hedonism is only a temptation to be overcome. The empiricist, however, constructing reason out of effectively charged sensations, makes hedonism the directing force behind all thought, seeing happiness entirely as physical pleasure, not eudaimonia, or living well. La Mettrie turned Socrates on his head. Socrates had always said that the moral life is the happy life, but La Mettrie wrote in his Anti-Seneca, or Seneque, I can't read French, my French is horrible. So La Mettrie wrote this in 1750. Since the pleasures of the mind are the real source of happiness, it is perfectly clear that, from the point of view of happiness, good and evil are things quite indifferent in themselves, and he who obtains greater satisfaction from doing evil will be happier than the man who obtains less satisfaction from doing good. This explains why so many scoundrels are happy in this life and shows that there is a kind of individual felicity which is to be found, not merely without virtue, but even in crime itself. That's very deep. Basically saying criminals live good and happy lives because the seeking of pleasure is so powerful for people. Let's read that quote again because that's so moving and that's so telling for the times that we're living in now, where we're living under an administration in the United States run by open criminals who seem to gleefully abscond with or violate norms, precedents, and laws. Since the pleasures of the mind are the real source of happiness, it is perfectly clear that, from the point of view of happiness, good and evil are things quite indifferent in themselves, and he who obtains greater satisfaction from doing evil will be happier than the man who obtains less satisfaction from doing good. Man, that's deep. That's the quote of the day. Here we see the fundamental crisis of naturalism, which was first confronted by the philosophers and which became acute after Darwin. If we are only machines destined to pursue pleasure and avoid pain, what can the ground of moral value and of meaning in our lives? If we are only machines destined to pursue pleasure and avoid pain, what can be the ground of moral value and of meaning in our lives? The early philosophers assumed as humanists that the world was made of humans by a beneficent, if non-Christian, creator. As the century progressed, however, it became increasingly evident that this optimism was unjustified. The Great Lisbon earthquake and tsunami of 1755, for example, blotted out over 50,000 lives and destroyed 85% of the city's buildings. Newton's universe seemed to be a machine indifferent to human life, which was a mere speck of no consequence. Moreover, the extension of materialism, determinism, and hedonism to human beings, while intellectually persuasive, was hard to accept emotionally. Diderot, for example, wrote in a letter, "I am maddened at being entangled in a devilish philosophy that my mind can't help approving and my heart refuting." The whole dilemma thus came down to a question of feelings. Feelings of freedom and dignity versus a natural desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain. There is a remarkably existentialist sentence in Lamettrie's L'Homme Machine. Who can be sure that the reason for man's existence is not simply the fact that he exists? He continued, perhaps he was thrown by chance on some spot on the earth's surface. Nobody knows how or why, but simply that he must live and die, like the mushrooms which appear from day to day. Lametrie stated the possibility of a meaningless world, the abyss of moral nihilism that every philosophe saw and tried to avoid. However, one man cheerfully jumped into that abyss, proclaiming the autonomy of pleasure, the illusion of morals, the rule of the strong, and a pleasurable life of crime. The Marquis de Sade, born 1740 and died in 1814, wrote in History of Juliet this description of why the strong, in the pursuit of happiness, should dominate the weak. The strong, in despoiling the weak, that is to say, in enjoying all the rights he has received from nature, in giving them the greatest possible extension, finds pleasure in proportion to this extension. The more atrociously he harms the weak, the more voluptuously he is thrilled. Injustice is his delectation. He enjoys the tears that his oppression snatches from the unfortunate wretch. The more he grieves him, the more he oppresses him, the happier he is. This truly delicious gratification never establishes itself better for the fortunate man that when the misery he produces is complete. Let him pillage then, let him burn, let him ravage, let him not leave the wretch more than the breath to prolong a life whose existence is necessary for the oppressor. Whatever he does will be in nature. Whatever he invents will be the active use of the forces which he has received from her. Whatever he does will be in nature. Whatever he invents will be only the active use of the forces which he has received from her. And the more he exercises his forces, the more he will experience pleasure. The better he will use his faculties, and the better, consequently, he will have served nature. If pleasure is the only goal in life that naturalism can find, then we should each seek it uninhibited by morals or the opinions of society, according to Sade. In doing so, we will be fulfilling natural law. The strong not only must, but should triumph over the weak. Sade extended comparative psychology to morals. Animals prey on one another without compunction. They have no moral law. We are animals, so we should act in the same way. Moral law is a metaphysical illusion. The philosophers first struggled with the problem of a world ruled only by efficient causes and hedonism, and tried to avoid Sade's logical extrapolation of naturalism. In the 20th century, the problem has remained unsolved, and in our own time we have seen moral nihilism proclaimed again, while modern existential humanists seek to restore humanity's dignity. The problem became acute in the 19th century when Darwin cut away all reason for believing that humans transcend nature. In Darwin's universe too, the strong destroy the weak. Sade was a harbinger of the moral nihilism that stared Victorians in the face and posed for their therapist, Freud, his deepest problem. Sade was a harbinger of the moral nihilism that stared Victorians in the face and posed for their therapist, Freud, his deepest problem. Enlightened ethical philosophies. Naturalist thinking about human nature, human society, and human ethics from Hobbes through the French naturalist starkly challenged existing ethical theories. If human nature was as depraved as Hobbes suggested, or so thin as to be nearly non-existent as the French naturalist suggested, then Aristotle's virtue ethics had no foundation at all. If there are no inherent human virtues to be allowed to flourish, then human happiness depended solely on material satisfaction and the suppression of human selfishness. Though Sod wickedly argued things the other way around. Human flourishing was exactly to be found in violence and oppression. Naturalistic theories, especially in France, did without God, so that Christian ethics based on following God's commands commanded no assent from atheists. Nietzsche would drive this point home in the 19th century. I have to read some Nietzsche before I die. As a result of these challenges and the waning of religious authority in the later 18th century, philosophers proposed two new forms of ethical thought and sought to revise and revive virtue ethics. What they had in common was a psychological turn of thought. It seemed that rules for right living could no longer be derived from sources outside human nature, whether in metaphysics, as Plato had argued, or in God, as Christians argued, but had to be found within human beings themselves, in their happiness, their reason, or their feelings. The first new ethical system was what philosophers call consequentialism. Right action is that which has the best outcomes, that is, consequences. The second was what philosophers call deontological ethics. Right action is that which stems from the rule governed, hence deontological from the Greek word for rule, deon. Choices for the moral will. So right action is that which stems from the rule governed, choices of the moral will. A third group of philosophers took the most psychological course of all, proposing a form of virtue, ethics, though rarely labeled as such, that saw morality as rooted in innate human feelings of moral approval and disapproval of right and wrong actions. Ethics of outcomes, utilitarianism. There are various forms of consequentialist ethics, but the most important was and remains utilitarianism, which in one form or another has powerfully influenced all of these social sciences. It proposed a simple and potentially quantifiable theory of human motivation, hedonism. First advanced by Greeks such as Democritus, hedonism proposes that people are moved solely by the pursuits of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Part of the appeal of utilitarianism is its flexibility. Although the principle of utility is simple, it respects individual differences and the quite varied kinds of pleasures and pains that people pursue or avoid. The principle of utility is fundamental to most theories in economics. In psychology, it provided the motivational doctrines of behaviorism and continues to influence theories of decision-making and choice. Turning hedonism into a practical, quantitative, scientific theory was the enterprise of an English reformer and Newton of the mind, Jeremy Bentham, born 1748 and died in 1832. He opened his Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, published in 1789, with a forceful statement of utilitarian hedonism. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Typical of an Enlightenment philosopher, Bentham's claim fused a scientific hypothesis about human nature with an ethical canon about how people ought to live. Not only do pleasure and pain govern us in all we do, the scientific hypothesis, they ought to do so as well, the moral canon. Previous thinkers had certainly recognized the temptation of hedonism, but they had hoped that it might be controlled by some other motive, for example, by the Scottish philosopher's moral sense. What made Bentham daring was his rejection of motives other than utility as superstitious nonsense, and his attempt to erect an ethics on that rejection. Bentham's definition of utility was, however, not limited to mere sensual pleasures and pains. Bentham also recognized the pleasures of wealth, power, piety, and benevolence, to name only a few. Bentham's Newtonian proposal that pleasure and pain might be quantified made his principle of utility scientifically important. The strength of Newtonian physics was its mathematical precision, and Bentham hoped to bring similar precision to the human sciences. His philosophic calculus, or calculus of happiness, attempted to measure units of pleasure and pain so that they might be entered into equations that would predict behavior or could be used by decision makers to make correct, that is, the most happiness maximizing choices. In economics, prices provide a convenient stand-in for Bentham's measure of happiness. Economists can readily determine how much people will pay for pleasures, whether cookies, concerts, cannabis, or cars, and how much they will pay to avoid pain, buying security systems, health insurance, or aspirin. And they have developed a highly mathematical science based on the principle of utility. In psychology, attempts to directly measure units of pleasure and pain have proved controversial, but nevertheless continue. For example, in the emerging field of behavioral economics, equations have been developed based on how much rats or pigeons will pay in terms of operant responses for various economic goods, such as food, water, or electrical stimulation. As a social reformer, Bentham wanted legislators, the audience Bentham aimed at in his principles, to employ the philosophic calculus in making the laws. Their goal should be the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That is, legislators should try to figure out how many happiness units and how many pleasure units would be generated in the country as a whole by any given act of government. And they should therefore always act to maximize the net amount of utility experienced by the nation as a whole. Because he believed that what is pleasurable and painful varies from person to person, Bentham generally advocated minimal government. In the utilitarian, or the view now known as the greatest happiness principle, people ought to be left alone to do what makes them happy, not dictated to by a meddling government pursuing its own utility function. Going to the comments, Nelson says, just captured some Venezuelan baddies. I'm sure you did, Nelson. The whole Latin world is about to be flooded with the baddest women you'd have never seen. BBL's just going to start flooding over the border. Y'all thought the bitches were bad when they came back in 2017. You ain't seen nothing yet. Wait until the whole country get empty, till they turn the whole thing upside down. It's going to be a mess. Shout out to my guy Nelson. We're going to continue here. Remember, we're finishing all of chapter 6 today, so we got 20 pages to read. We got a lot to read, and I'm doing my best, but we've barely cracked the first 10 pages, and I've been on here for about an hour. My God. Woo! This is a dense text. Take a quick nose break and water break, because we've been reading for like the past hour, so. All right. Tastes like lemon water. All right, let's continue here. Ethics of duty, going to Kant. Just as he could not abide the cognitive blank slate of British empiricism, Kant could not abide the moral blank slate of the French empiricists or the consequentialist ethics of the utilitarians. The problem was that traditional systems of ethics do not delve deeply enough in their inquiries about what we ought to do as a matter of moral duty. Instead, they tell us about how we ought to behave within an unexamined moral framework. How we ought to behave within an unexamined framework of assumption about our goals. Thus, the ancient Greeks said that if you seek happiness, eudaimonia, then you ought to behave in certain ways, such as telling the truth and being brave. Thus, Greek moral reasoning was about the best means to achieve an already presupposed end, happiness. They took eudaimonia for granted. Hedonistic theories, especially in their extreme French form, were even worse, because compared to Greek eudaimonia, their notion of human happiness, the pursuit of pleasure, was cramped and thin, suggesting that playing cards was just as morally worthy as creating art if it brought the same amount of pleasure to the card player and the artist. Moreover, Kant wanted to do for morals what he had done for science. It was not enough for him that Newton's theory worked beautifully as an account of physical nature. He wanted to show that Newton's theory was necessarily, metaphysically, true. So he was unhappy with moral theories that located morality in what happened to be true about human beings. He wanted an account of morality rooted in the demands of pure reason, not the vagaries of human nature, aiming to free the study of morality from the niggardly provision of our stepmother nature. Okay. I don't know why I'm surprised the N-word got dropped in here. I don't know why I'm surprised, because Thomas Hardy Leahey is like an Islamophobe, and that's only a few steps away from being explicitly anti-black, right? So I'm not surprised, but God, damn. Okay. Continuing here. Moral commands are imperatives. They say what you ought to do. In Kant's terminology, previous moral philosophers had discussed only hypothetical or conditional imperatives that tell one what to do to achieve a certain goal. Kant wanted to formulate a categorical or unconditional imperative that rationally spelled out what was right or wrong without regard to any specific goal. Psychologically, Kant wanted to honor what he found awesome, the moral law within me. Doing what is right often seems hard and is felt as a kind of compulsion, not to give in to temptation. In short, doing what's right feels like a kind of duty, not simply a calculated means to a pleasurable or profitable end. One way to capture this insight is thinking of duty as obeying a law laid down by an outside authority, whether it is God, I won't cheat on my spouse because God forbids it, even though I'd enjoy it, or a legislature. I, as a prosecuting attorney, must give exculpating evidence to the defense because the law commands it, even if I lose my case. In Kant's analysis, reason, not God or legislature, is the ultimate lawgiver that requires moral actions. In his Metaphysics of Science, Kant proposed that the universal transcendental ego, common to all conscious beings, forms experience into a knowable pattern. In his Ethics, Kant proposed a law of reason that commands all rational beings, whether human or not. The categorical imperative is that I should always act only on that maxim through which I can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Always treating humanity, whether in my own self or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. Here, the rational transcendental self becomes a lawgiver for all rational beings, not just for the individual caught in a moral dilemma. Thus, if I choose to tell the truth in a difficult situation, the categorical imperative says that at the moment I choose to tell the truth, at the same time I am making telling the truth a universal law that all rational beings must follow in all circumstances necessarily, just as the law of gravity affects all physical bodies in all circumstances necessarily. So Kant's, categorical imperative is like super famous, in philosophy. I definitely learned about it during my first time in undergrad over 10 years ago. You know what I'm saying? I do find some flaws in it, though it is a pretty good premise on face value. Treat every action as if it were to be a universal law, and that will help you decide whether this action is right or wrong. But in this case of telling the truth, in general, we do want the truth to be told, and that to be a universal law. It should be the right thing for all people to do, to tell the truth. But let's say, my wife asks, do I look fat in this dress? And I don't want us to have a fight. I want to get some coochie later. So is the universal law to lie to your wife, to say she doesn't look fat in the dress so that you can get some coochie later? You know what I mean? Like, there's always going to be exceptions to laws and rules. You know what I mean? So I'm just pointing out some flaws in this. But I'm going to continue here. Kant is not, however, endorsing naturalistic determinism or Lemaitrie's sort, the idea that choices are illusions, that everything we do is predetermined. Our moral choices are real. We can, if we choose, lie, commit adultery, or conceal evidence. The categorical imperative does not make these choices impossible. It makes them morally wrong for all rational beings in all circumstances. Kant's ethics honors one human intuition, that doing the right thing can feel compelled as if by an external authority. But on the other hand, Kantian ethics seems too stern, too insensitive to circumstances, and too far from human nature and real moral decision-making to be plausible as an account of how people make moral decisions, or attractive as an analysis of how we ought to make moral decisions. If lying is in all circumstances morally wrong, then it's wrong for me to lie to a killer about the whereabouts of his or her intended victim, or to Nazi agents seeking Anne Frank. If all humans are to be treated as equally valuable, then given the choice of saving my child or a stranger from a burning house, I should flip a coin. If I see two people donating money to charity and doing volunteer work with the poor, and find that one does so because he loves people and is moved by sympathy to help them, while the other finds the poor repulsive and repugnant and helps them out of moral duty, despite the unhappiness being among the poor brings her, then I must, with Kant, conclude that only the latter person is morally worthy, because only she acts upon the demands of reason, while the former acts merely as a human animal spurred emotionally by the provision of our stepmother, nature. The third enlightened system of ethics rested on an understanding of human nature richer than the French and found right motives in feeling rather than reason, building morality around human nature rather than in opposition to it. Ethics of sensibility, the Scottish school of moral sense. As always, the Scotsman Hume was the anti-Kant. In his enquiry concerning the principles of morals, Hume wrote, "There has been a controversy started of late, much better worth examination, concerning the general foundation of morals, whether they be derived from reason or from sentiment, whether we attain the knowledge of them by a chain of argument and induction, or by an immediate feeling and finer internal sense, whether, like all sound judgment of truth and falsehood, they should be the same to every rational, intelligent being, or whether, like the perception of beauty and deformity, they be founded entirely on the particular fabric and constitution of the human species." That was said by Hume in 1751. Recall that in his account of the human mind, Hume included the important category of the passions, or as they were also known in the 18th century, the sentiments. Crucial to Hume's analysis of the concept of causality was the sentiment of or feeling of necessity that must hold between events if we are to call them causes. In his analysis of moral judgment, Hume again appeals to sentiment, to naturally given, arising from the particular fabric and constitution of the human species, moral judgments of right and wrong. Just as we immediately feel that some things are beautiful and other things are ugly, Hume drew a close analogy between aesthetic and moral judgment. So we spontaneously judge some actions as right and others as wrong. Hume and his fellow Scots, in opposition to Kant, grounded human morality in human nature. For them, however, the provision of nature was anything but niggardly. I'm probably going to get demonetized because I'm reading Thomas Hardy Leahey's wanton use of the N-word. Anyway, going to the comments. Nelson says, the review from yesterday was great. Why didn't you bring Acti? Acti can join. She might join for the next one. We're going to be watching it next time. We're going to be watching it in a few hours, actually. We're going to do the second live stream reaction to Can't Get You Out of My Head in a few hours after I finish these last 20 pages in chapter 6. All right. The demon from Corino says, yeah, bring her, or it's just two men talking. Well, I don't know what's wrong with two men talking. You know what I mean? Yeah, Acti could come too. I didn't know y'all were big fans of acting. Y'all love acting like that? Okay, well, that's cool. I mean, I'm not surprised people are more fans of acting. I'm an asshole. She's an angel. You know what I mean? So, I'm not surprised. But we will be doing that. I'll invite her. She might be busy. You know what I mean? She's a busy girl. All right. Demon from Corino says, can I join? Of course. When we do the live stream, everybody can join. All you got to do is click the link. All you got to do is click the link and anybody can join the live stream call. Anyway, we only have about 10 more pages to go in this text, so let's wrap this up. To the horror of Kant, Hobbes, and Sade seemed to set humans, to the horror of Kant, Hobbes and Sade seemed to set humans in a fetid swamp of violence and immorality from which there is no rescue save the arbitrary power of a police state. Kant tried to rescue morality from relativism and tyranny by arguing that within us is an imperative moral law that does not need the state to operate. However, if we move to the cooler climate of Scotland, we find the common sense philosophers reminding us that people are not as bad as Hobbes, Sade, and their alarmed readers fear or like to think. Although crime and war exist, most of the time most people act decently toward one another, and when they do not, they feel guilty or ashamed. Animal mothers care for their young. Animal fights rarely result in death, and many animal species live in cooperative groups, all without society or government of any kind. Surely the Scots, including Hume, argue human nature, while not always moral, tends to be moral. I repeat, surely the Scots, including Hume, argue human nature, while not always moral, tends to be moral. Scottish philosophers maintained the Enlightenment project of constructing a science of human nature, but they found in human nature a new foundation for the explanation of morality. Going to the comments. Nelson says, Autistic Cool gave the movie clapper sign. What's the name of that thing? The movie clapper, I guess. Anyway, action. The Demon from Carino says, you and Nelson just have discussions, have all the time. Acty brings it down to earth. Acty does. Everybody comes and brings. Number one, when I do the live call-in show, the live call-in shows are for everybody to join. The majority of the time for the live call-in shows, it's Nelson, because Nelson is not afraid to come on and speak his opinion, whether he agrees with me or disagrees with me, I don't care. Or it's white supremacists coming to troll. So if you want to actually, be involved in the conversation and chop it up, you can always come and join the live call-ins. We will be doing one very soon, and everybody is welcome to join. The white supremacists will get reported to Zoom so that their accounts can be deleted and everybody else can have a good-ass time in the conversation. We're going to continue here. All right, Thomas Reid's own teacher, George Turnbull, concisely set out the Scottish position. Turnbull aimed to do for morals what Newton did for nature, inquiring into moral phenomenon in the same manner as we do into physical ones. Nature is orderly and ruled by natural laws, observed Turnbull, and the existence of Newton's physics demonstrates that God furnished human nature with mental faculties, capable of knowing nature's order and discovering nature's laws. By analogy, Turnbull reasoned human behavior is orderly and ruled by moral laws, and God has furnished us with a moral sense by which we may discover moral laws. I am apt to think that everyone shall immediately perceive that he has a moral sense inherent in him, and really inseparable from him. If we experience approbation and disapprobation, then we must have an approving and disapproving faculty. That is, we are equipped by nature so as to see that some actions are right. We approve of them, and others are wrong. We disapprove of them. Scottish moral sense theory was important in three respects. First, it coolly rejected the extreme claims of Hobbes and the French naturalists. People are made to be sociable and to behave decently, not to be utterly vicious and selfish. People spontaneously and without coercion care for each other and try to do what is right. La Méthodi's happy criminals and Sade's sadists are exceptions, not images of what we would all be without Hobbes's authoritarian state. Second, it helped to establish the science of human nature, psychology. There are principles that govern human behavior other than those imposed by governmental nomos, and it is possible for us to learn and use them. Finally, the Scottish school exerted great influence in psychology's modern home, the United States. Along with many Americans, Thomas Jefferson read the great Scottish philosophers. When he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal," he built on Reid, "Moral truths may be divided into two classes, the first of which are such as are self-evident to every man whose understanding and moral faculty are ripe. And Thomas Jefferson was a notorious child rapist and slaveholder. Going to the comments, Nelson says, did she watch the first episode? I watched 2 more episodes after you guys finished yesterday. I don't think Acti saw the first episode. I played her the clip of that Indian man getting discriminated against at that barbershop, but she didn't watch it. This is anti-YouTube. This is anti-YouTube. Even my wife doesn't watch most of my content. You know what I'm saying? Most of my content gets 0 views. That's sort of like the way it's supposed to be. It's anti-YouTube. So Acti doesn't watch most of this stuff. You know what I'm saying? Nelson says, why doesn't this author discuss racism? Because he is a racist. Because he is a racist. Duh, nigga. Duh, nigga. Come on, man. This was the same man who said that the Islamic world had done nothing with philosophy. Like, bruh, come on. Anyway, I'm going to continue here. On one point, the Scots were divided. They agreed that human nature was sociable and benign, and that humans possess a moral sense. But they disagreed on the source of human nature. Reid and his followers thought it came from God. Hume, the atheist, said it came from nature itself, as Kant feared. It is needless to push our researches so far as to ask why we have humanity or fellow feeling with others. It is sufficient that this is experienced to be a principle in human nature. Hume asked only how human nature worked and refrained from asking why it is what it is. In the next century, Darwin began to create a science that only today, as the field of evolutionary psychology, could answer. Hume's unasked question. All right. Applying psychological ideas, social engineering. From developing a science of human nature, it was but a step to applying that science to the improvement of human life. One of the first and most significant attempts at social engineering was carried out by the businessman and philanthropist Robert Owen, who was born in 1771 and died in 1858. Robert Owen was at his cotton mills in New Lanark, Scotland. Owen combined the idea that humans were machines with Locke's empiricism. He said that workers were vital machines who needed as much care and attention as a factory's inanimate machines, and that children are, without exception, passive and wonderfully contrived compounds, which, by an accurate previous and subsequent attention, founded on a correct knowledge of the subject, may be formed collectively to have any human character. Therefore, a new utopian society may be arranged on a due combination of the foregoing principles in such a manner as not only to withdraw vice, poverty, and, in a great degree, misery from the world, but also to place in every individual under such circumstances in which he shall enjoy more permanent happiness than can be given to any individual under the principles which have hitherto regulated society. Owen's vision was to make New Lanark into an engineer community rather than a mere factory. He provided schooling, which had not yet become a state responsibility, a museum, a music hall, and a ballroom, the premier meeting place of the turn of the century. See Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. For Owen, a benevolent employer was concerned with his workers' happiness, not only their productivity. Nevertheless, he expected that happy workers may be easily trained and directed to produce a large increase of pecuniary gain for their employer. Owen's ideas anticipated the human relations movement in business and industry of the 1930s. Owen's scheme at New Lanark was not a success, and he moved to Indiana, where he established another utopian community, New Harmony. It too failed, being abandoned in 1828. Social engineering on a grander scale, a whole country, was the goal of the French Revolution. The revolutionaries put the leading ideas of the Enlightenment and the way of ideas itself into the service of building a new society and a new humanity to inhabit it. The revolutionary Faber de Elangantine looked to Lockean empiricism to construct the propaganda, the new empire of images, by which the revolution might erase loyalty to the old regime and build affection for the new. We conceive of nothing except by images. Even the most abstract analysis or the most metaphysical formulations can only take effect through images. Rousseau wanted to take children away from their parents to be raised by the state. A revolutionary leader, Louis de Saint-Just, born 1767 and died in 1794, a short life, sought to make the scheme a reality. With Helvetius, Saint-Just looked forward to the possibility of the scientific control of human behavior, which depended on denying free will. We must form men so that they can only will what we wish them to will. But Saint-Just also wanted that an empire of virtue was brought, but Saint-Just also warned that an empire of virtue was bought at a terrible price. Those who want to do good in this world must sleep only in the tomb. Saint-Just was an inadvertent prophet. The French Revolution began in an unstable stew of ancient grievances. The Enlightenment's calls for scientific reform and the Counter-Enlightenment's reverence of emotion and action. The reforming philosophers did not realize with what social dynamite they were playing. The French people had accumulated centuries of vaguely understood but powerfully felt resentments as the growth of the monarchical state began to weigh heavily on them. In the end, the French Revolution cast doubt on the providential hopes of the philosophers. They aimed to reform humanity, but ultimately created the violence of the Reign of Terror, which in turn invited its suppression by a military coup led by a man who would be emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon carried out some Prussian-style enlightened reforms, such as a complete rewriting of French law, but his egoistic drive to conquer Europe and Russia ended in disaster, and the old Bourbon kings were restored, almost as if there had been no revolution at all. The tragedy, the tragedy. The Enlightenment and women. As may have become apparent, the Enlightenment was a male affair. Really? Although the French philosophers met in salons hosted by aristocratic women, the philosophers themselves were men, and they addressed questions about women only occasionally. In England, Locke said that the mind had no sex, and that women might be educated as well as men. Nevertheless, most philosophers simply assumed that women were naturally inferior to men. The one philosopher who did explicitly address women's role in society was the counter-enlightenment thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau believed that nature had designed men and women for separate roles in life and that their education should be constructed to accommodate, not erase, these natural differences. A woman's education must therefore be planned in relation to man. Rousseau wrote, "To be pleasing in his sight, to win his respect and love, to make his life pleasant and happy. These are the duties of women. These are the duties of woman for all time, and this is what she should be taught while she is young." Rousseau admired the Spartans and echoed their attitudes to women. Women should not be strong like men for them, so that their sons may be strong. Women should not be strong like men, but for them, so that their sons may be strong. Rousseau said this in 1762. In the end, Rousseau concluded the natural role of women was to serve men even when they are tyrants. Women are, and should be, formed to obey a creature so imperfect as man, a creature often vicious and always faulty. She should learn to submit to injustice and to suffer the wrongs inflicted on her by her husband without complaint. Rousseau's ideas about educating women to serve men gave rise to a bizarre experiment in behavior modification a century before the term was coined. An Englishman, Peter Day, put Rousseau's theory into practice by acquiring a living doll to transform Pygmalion fashion into the perfect wife, devoting herself to her husband and offspring. He obtained a blonde girl of 12 from an orphanage. He named her Sabrina and tried to condition her to become Rousseau's ideal Spartan wife. To teach her Spartan indifference to pain, he dropped melted wax on her arm, and to teach her Spartan indifference to fear, he fired blanks at her skirt. She flinched at the first stimulus and shrieked at the second. Days concluded that Sabrina had a weak mind and abandoned her in his experiment. That's torture. That's crazy. All right, had to stop what I was doing to say fuck Rousseau. Okay, that's what Acti said in the chat. I mean, if you want to, man, I just want you to know these are the forefathers of psychology, Acti. These are your forefathers of your field. These are your forefathers. Show some respect. Show some respect. Anyway, poor Sabrina. You know what's the worst fate of any woman? It's being blonde-haired and blue-eyed. I don't get why, Jesus Christ, men of all types are obsessed. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman. You know what we're going to do with the blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman? Let's torture her. Let's pour hot wax on her and shoot guns at her and see if she flinches and try to make her into the Spartan ideal wife. You might as well be born. Better to be a brunette, I would argue. Better to be a brunette than a blonde. Blondes get tortured. My God. Anyway, there were opponents of Rousseau who adopted Locke's view on the educability of all minds, male or female. They argued that women's subservient place in society was not ordained by nature, but was a result of tradition and poor education. The American Judith Murray, writing under the pen name Constantia, said that the alleged superiority of men's intellect rested not in nature, but could trace its source in the difference of education between men and women. Mary Wollstonecraft, born 1759 and died in 1797, grandmother of Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, wrote, "It is vain to expect virtue from women till they are in some degree independent of men. While they are absolutely dependent on their husbands, they will be cunning." Rousseau said cunning was a natural gift of women. So women will be mean and selfish, said Wollstonecraft in 1792. In France, after the early revolutionaries proclaimed the rights of man, Olympe de Gouges, born 1748 and died in 1793, demanded the adoption of a Declaration of the Rights of Woman. She called to her fellow women in the spirit of the French Enlightenment project, "Woman, wake up. The rocsin of reason is being heard throughout the whole universe. Discover your rights. The powerful empire of nature is no longer surrounded by prejudice, fanaticism, superstition, and lies." Gouges said this in 1791. Despite these fierce voices, the immediate future lay with Rousseau. The 19th century would be deeply influenced by his idea that men and women had separate spheres of influence, the male world of commerce, politics, and war versus the intimate female world of home and hearth. Freud would identify women's confinement to a separate sphere as a prime cause of their neurosis. And when Francis Galton proposed tests by which the fittest young men and women might be selected for intermarriage, beauty and skill at housewifery were among the criteria by which women were to be chosen as mates for intelligent men. Anyway, going to the comments, Kamal says, "What a shitbag." Calling Rousseau a shitbag is almost a compliment. It's almost a compliment to shit. That's offensive to shitbags and a compliment to Rousseau to call him such. But we're almost done here. We only have a few more pages to go, about 7 more. Let's go. The Counter-Enlightenment. Are the fruits of reason poisoned? Newton had applied human reason, logic, and mathematics to nature, and he had shown that the human mind could encompass nature's laws and bend nature to human will. The vision of the philosophers of the Enlightenment was that Newtonian reason could be applied to human affairs, to psychology, ethics, and politics. In the Newtonian scheme of the philosophers, scientific reason would banish superstition, religious revelation, and historical tradition, setting in their place laws of human conduct whose use by enlightened despots could create the perfect human society. The philosophers were intolerant of cultural diversity because cultural traditions are not products of reason, so that all existing cultures fall short of the rational ideal. The philosophers were scornful of history, regarding it as no more than gossip from the past, entirely irrelevant to understanding contemporary society, and to the task of reconstructing society in the light of reason. The philosophers' imperialism of reason in science provoked a reaction from diverse thinkers who found it horrifyingly unhuman. Against the imperialism of natural science, they set the autonomy of culture, and against the excesses of reason, they set the feelings of the heart. Their horror at the mechanistic universe of the philosophers was expressed by the English poet William Blake, who was born in 1757 and died in 1827. I turn my eyes to the schools and universities of Europe, and there behold the loom of Locke, whose woof rages dire. Washed by the water wheels of Newton, black the cloth, in heavy wreaths folds over every nation, cruel works. Of many wheels I view, wheel without wheel, with cogs tyrannic, moving by compulsion each other. The criterion and rule of truth is to have made it. Giambattista Vico, who was born in 1668 and died in 1744. One current of the counter-enlightenment began with this obscure Italian philosopher who formed his ideas even before the Enlightenment began. Neoplatonic Christian theology and Cartesian philosophy had placed the human mind in a spiritual realm beyond the reach of science. The philosophers denied that human beings stood in any respect outside Newtonian science, and looked toward a universal experimental ethics based on the idea that human nature is everywhere the same and is unchanging. If such a nature exists, it follows that science may know it, and technology may construct around it a perfect society. Vico began a tradition in philosophy that respects the old Platonic and Christian intuition that human beings are radically different from the other animals, but does so without invoking an immaterial soul. Instead, followers of Vico hold that what makes humans unique is culture, and that therefore there can be no Newtonian science of human mind and behavior. Vico began with the astonishing assertion that knowledge of nature is inferior, second-hand knowledge compared to knowledge of society and history. Vico's criterion of knowledge derived from the scholastics of the Middle Ages, who held that one cannot really know something unless one has made it. In the case of nature, only God can really know the natural world because he made it. To us humans, nature is a given, a brute fact, something we can observe only from the outside, never from the inside. People, however, make their societies in the historical process of creation. We can see our own lives from the inside, and through sympathetic understanding, we can understand the lives of men and women in other cultures and other historical times. For Vico, then, history is the greatest science. Through history, we come to know how our society, or any society we choose to study, was created. History is not gossip, said Vico, but the process of human self-creation. The Enlightenment philosophers claimed that there was a universal, timeless human nature that could be known to science and on which we could build a perfect society. But according to Vico, human beings make themselves through history, so there is no eternal human nature, and each culture must be respected for the human creation it is. We understand cultures by studying what they create, especially their myths and language. Myths express the soul of a culture at a certain point of development, and language shapes and expresses the thoughts of its members. To understand another's times or places, myths, and language is thus to understand how men and women thought and felt then and there. Vico anticipated a distinction that became clearer in Herder and clearer still in 19th century German histories. The distinction between Naturwissenschaft and Geisteswissenschaft. Naturwissenschaft is Newtonian natural science, built on observation of nature from the outside, noting regularities in events and summarizing them in scientific laws. Geisteswissenschaft is much harder to translate, meaning literally spiritual science, but more often rendered today as human science. Human science studies the human creations of history and society. Its method is not observation from without, but sympathetic understanding from within. It is apparent that psychology straddles the divides between the two sciences. People are part of nature, things, and as such are subject in part to natural science. But people live in human cultures, and as such are subject to human science. Once division of psychology between experimental, physiological psychology of human conscious experience on the one hand, and Volker psychology, the study, as Vico recommended, of human myth, custom, and language on the other hand, reflected Vico as well as Kant. Within Germany, however, the distinction was challenged by once young pupils who wanted psychology to be a science on a par with physics. Outside Germany, the division was largely unknown and psychology was assimilated, as the philosophers would have wished, to natural science and the search for universal laws of human behavior. I don't understand how Vico's understanding is not also anthropology. You know, if it's all about studying human culture, history, civilization, etc., how is this not just another way of phrasing, anthropology? Blowing my nose real quick. All right. Continuing here, box 6.2, Science, Modernity, and the Counter-Enlightenment. So, going here, the central idea of the Enlightenment was that people should live by the light of reason alone. This meant that ultimately cultural differences between peoples and nations were fated to melt away, and that non-rational sources of authority such as religion and tradition would be vanquished by science. The figures of the Counter-Enlightenment were skeptical that people could live by reason alone, because living by reason alone was hard. One would have to carefully think through every decision, and because it was terrifying. Tradition and religion encoded the accumulated wisdom of millennia of human life and created humane institutions that concealed and made bearable the necessary exercise of power. In many respects, the turning point of modernism was the French Revolution of 1789, the first political revolution carried out self-consciously in the name of reason. The political philosopher Edmund Burke had supported the American Revolution as an assertion of traditional British rights against a tyrannical monarchy, but opposed the French Revolution for seeking to overturn tradition altogether. Sorry, go in here. I have to check something real quick for work. Hold on. Checking something, no? All right. Nothing to see here, boys. Nothing to see here, boys. Okay. The political philosopher Edmund Burke had supported the American Revolution as an assertion of traditional British rights against a tyrannical monarchy, but opposed the French Revolution for seeking to overturn tradition altogether. He believed that the power of social norms, culture, derives from history, from the traditions despised by the makers of the French Revolution. Describing the execution of the Queen of France by the modernist political order arising then in France, Burke, in 1790, wrote, "All the pleasing illusions which made power gentle and obedience liberal, which harmonized the different shades of life, and which by a bland assimilation incorporated into politics the sentiments which beautify and soften private society, are to be dissolved by this new conquering empire of light and reason. All the decent drapery of life is to be rudely torn off. all the superadded ideas furnished from the wardrobe of a moral imagination, which the heart owns and the understanding ratifies as necessary to cover the defects of our naked, shivering nature, and to raise it to dignity in our own estimation, are to be exploded as a ridiculous, absurd, and antiquated fashion. On this scheme of things, a king is but a man, a queen is but a woman is but an animal not of the highest order. On the scheme of this barbarous philosophy, which is the offspring of cold hearts and muddy understandings, and which is as void of solid wisdom as it is destitute of all taste and elegance, laws are to be supported only by their own terrible power. One of the defining thinkers of modernism was Friedrich Nietzsche, born 1844 and died in 1900. And interestingly, he agreed with Burke about the source of morality's power, but put the modernist interpretation on it. He asked a penetrating, that is, from a modernist perspective, unmasking question about witches, and gave it a scientific, that is, modern answer. Most of you know about witch persecutions, and it's often said in psychology and religious authorities. However, there were certainly people who honestly believed that they were witches, that some confessions of witchcraft were not coerced, and that the witches in question felt genuine guilt for offending God's law. Should freely confessed witches feel guilt? Nietzsche asks, no. He answers and adds alarmingly, thus it is with all guilt. Because there is no God, there can be no sin, and hence no guilt. The witches' feelings of guilt were coerced not by their interrogators, but by the society in which they grew up, which effectively brainwashed them into believing in God, the devil, sorcery, and sin. From a scientific perspective, they should feel no sin. Guilt is a secondary sense property, an illusion of consciousness, conditioned into us by society. Psychologist B.F. Skinner endorsed Nietzsche's conclusion in 1971 in his Beyond Freedom and Dignity, in which he argued that since all behavior is strictly determined and there is no free will, that freedom, ideas of moral responsibility, and the idea of human dignity are delusions to be abandoned and replaced by scientific social management. Once again, the reason that we're reading these books and diving into these ideas from open racists, right? Because Thomas Hardy Leahey is a racist. He's an Islamophobe. Like, the man just used the N-word twice just for shits and giggles deep off in his text because he knew nobody was going to read it, right? But the reason we do this is that so that we can understand the white man's technology and his methods and reasons for understanding and unleashing wickedness on the world. And in Enlightenment thinking and in modernist thinking and even in postmodernist thinking, they're constantly trying to reason how to basically enslave everybody else and morally quantify justifications for basically harming all other types of people. That's essentially Western thought in a nutshell. How can we make you a slave and make it morally your responsibility for becoming a slave? That's essentially what this is, right? So I'm going to continue here. We live in a world we ourselves create. Johann Gottfried Herder, who lived in 1744 and died in 1803. Vico was little read outside his own circle in Italy. However, his ideas reappeared independently asserted in the works of Herder, who rejected the Enlightenment's worship of reason and universal truth in favor of Romanticism's trust in the human heart and a historical reverence for many human truths. Herder's views are remarkably similar to Vico's, although they were formed in ignorance of Vico's works. His motto, "We live in a world we ourselves create," could have been said by Vico Herder too, stressed the absolute uniqueness of each living or historical culture. We should strive to fulfill ourselves and our own culture, not slavishly follow the classical styles and attitudes of a bygone age. Herder is modern in his belief that each person should try to fulfill his or her potential as a total person instead of being an alienated collection of roles. Herder opposed faculty psychology for its fragmentation of the human personality. For both the individual and the individual's culture, Herder stressed organic development. Because each culture is unique, Herder opposed any attempt to impose one's culture's values on any other. He detested the tendency of the philosophes to caricature the past and hold out their own times as a universal model for humanity. Herder even went so far as to imply the degeneracy of the age of reason. It was artificial. It ate the Greeks and Romans. It worshipped reason and neglected spirituality. Herder's views were highly influential, especially in Germany. Although Kant had written one of the great manifestos of the Enlightenment, What is Enlightenment? And although Prussia's Frederick the Great was the prototypical enlightened despot, the ahistorical and aggressively rationalist attitudes of the philosophes did not take root in Germany, which found Herder's emphasis on historical development and profound feeling more attractive. German philosophy rejected the exaltation of individual consciousness found in the Enlightenment. Fichte wrote, The individual life has no existence, since it has no value in itself, but must and should sink to nothing, while, on the contrary, the race alone exists. Although Herder and Fichte defined race in terms of common language rather than the fanciful biology of the later Nazis, they helped create an environment in which Germans regarded themselves as special. As Fichte wrote, we appear to be the elect of the universal divine plan. German psychology would be deeply shaped by German philosophy's alienation from the Enlightenment. German thinkers, including Wundt and even the proud Jew Freud, saw themselves as apart from and better than the supposedly shallower thinkers to their west, and in turn English-speaking psychologists would have little use for the impractical alleged profundities of German Geisteswissenschaft. More generally, Herder helped lay the foundation for Romanticism. He passionately opposed the mock classical art of his time, calling modern critics masters of dead learning. Instead, he advocated heart, warmth, blood, humanity, life. Descartes had said, I think, therefore I am. Condillac implied, I sense, therefore I am. Herder wrote, I feel, I am. Thus ended for many people the rule of abstract reason, the geometric spirit, and reasonable emotion. Instead, organic development led by emphatic emotion was the base of the new Romanticism. Nature versus civilization. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, our friend Rousseau appears again, who lived from 1712 and died in 1778. O Almighty God, Thou who holds all things in thy grasp, deliver us from the learning and destructive arts of our fathers, and give us back our ignorance, our innocence, and our poverty, the only gifts that make us happy, and are precious in thy sight. Can we forget that in the very bosom of Greece herself there arose a city which became famous through a happy ignorance and the wisdom of her laws, a commonwealth peopled rather by demigods than men? So far did their virtue outshine humanity. O Sparta, thou proof of the folly of vain learning, whilst all manner of vice, led by the arts and sciences, were introduced into Athens, whilst the tyrant was busy in picking up the works of the prince of poets, thou were chasing from the walls all sciences, all learning together with their professors. In France, the Counter-Enlightenment began in 1749. In that year, the Dijon Academy of Arts and Sciences set an essay contest on the question whether the restoration of the arts and sciences has contributed to the refinement of morals. Rousseau's essay began his career as an influential writer. No clearer statement of the ideas of the Counter-Enlightenment exists than Rousseau's statements in his essay. He rejected enlightenment, yearning to return to the days of ignorance and poverty that the Enlightenment philosophes rejected, because he wanted to restore the naive childhood of natural men and women. He preferred ancient Sparta, which disdained art, philosophy, and science as weak, to Athens, the home of Phidias's Parthenon, Plato's philosophy, and Aristotle's science. For Rousseau, knowledge, the light of the Enlightenment, was corrupted. It was dark, not light, bringer of evil, not happiness. Rousseau argued against the tide of enlightened opinion that the answer to the Academy's question was no. He wrote, Deliver us from the enlightenment and the fatal arts of our fathers, and give us back ignorance, innocence, and poverty, the only goods which can make our happiness. In many ways, Rousseau's complaints about the Enlightenment paralleled Herder's, although Rousseau was less conscious of history than was Herder. Rousseau said, "To exist is to feel, and the first impulses of the heart are always right." Sentiments that recall Herder and point to Romanticism. Like Herder, Rousseau rejected mechanism because it could not explain human free will. Rousseau argued that Hobbes's conceptions of human nature and of society. Hobbes had found in the English Civil War an impression of what people without government were like, violent and warlike. In Rousseau's time, travelers from the South Pacific brought different tales of what people were like without government. They drew an idyllic picture of life unencumbered by the demands of European society. People lived without clothes, ate the food freely available on the trees, and took sexual pleasure when they found it. In the Pacific Islands, it appeared, the life of humans was the opposite of being solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. These island peoples became Rousseau's famous noble savages. Rousseau argued that the present state of society corrupted and degraded human nature. Rousseau advocated building a new, less alienating society, and the makers of the French Revolution followed him. Rousseau was a friend of Condillac and was similarly empiricist and interested in education. Rousseau described his ideal educational program in Emile, published in 1672, in which a child and his tutor retire from corrupt civilization and return to nature for education. Rousseau advocated a kind of non-directional education, believing that a child should be allowed to express his or her native talents, and described a good education as one that cultivates the natural growth of these talents. The tutor should not impose views on the student. Nevertheless, behind the apparent freedom is firm control. At one point, Rousseau described what we would call open education. It is rarely your business to suggest what he ought to learn. It is for him to want to learn. However, earlier he had written, "Let him always think he is master while you are really master. There is no subjection so complete as that which preserves the forms of freedom." For Rousseau, the empiricist, the corrupt state of civilization can be overcome by a proper education, which perfects the potentialities of each person. Herder believed in self-fulfillment, but he was less individualistic, seeing fulfillment in the larger context of the person's culture, which the person helps perfect while perfecting self. Rousseau's influence has been wide. His affinities with Romanticism and political revolutionaries have been alluded to. In education, he inspired those in the 1960s who supported open education of the whole child against those who preferred highly structured teaching of separate basic skills. He is also behind those who want to reform society through education. In his belief in human malleability and perfectibility, he foreshadowed B.F. Skinner, who advocated a carefully controlled society whose goal is human happiness, although Skinner openly disbelieved in human freedom. The irrational realm of the unconscious, mesmerism. The term mesmerism comes from the name of the movement's founder, Franz Anton Mesmer, who was born in 1734 and died in 1815, a Viennese physician who attributed numerous bodily diseases to influences exerted by an impalpable fluid penetrating the entire universe. Mesmer believed that this fluid was vital to the nervous activity of the body, and that physicians could cure various diseases by manipulating the fluid in a patient's body. Mesmer began by using magnets to draw the fluid away from the afflicted areas, but he soon decided that the fluid was susceptible to movements of his hands over his patients' bodies, animal magnetism, rather than to mineral magnetism. Mesmer devised a complicated electrotherapy for his patients, involving, among other things, striking the diseased parts of the body with his hands or a magic wand, tubs of water with iron rods focused on a patient's symptoms, and a crisis room lined with mattresses in which Mesmer's cures were effected during a kind of seizure. He specialized in what we now call functional illnesses, those that come from purely psychological causes. Although it was suggested at the time that at least some of the cures were a result of the patient's suggestibility, Mesmer firmly resisted any such hypothesis, insisting on his theory of animal fluids. No single element of mesmerism was new. The curing of apparently physical diseases by inspired individuals is a staple belief of many religions. It was also practiced by such contemporaries of Mesmer as Valentin Greatraks in England and Johann Gassner in Germany. Greatraks' speciality was scrofula, or the king's evil, so called because the touch of the monarch was said to cure it. If Mesmer's practice was not new, neither was the hypothesis of an ineffable universal fluid. Central to Newton's universe was the ether, a subtle fluid that carried electromagnetic waves and defined absolute space. A whole line of alchemic doctors had believed in a universal fluid essential to health, and even such a modern chemist as Robert Boyle attributed Greatraks' cures to invisible particles passing from doctor to patient. Gassner was a German priest who allegedly cast out demons. Mesmer himself investigated Gassner, concluding that Gassner's cures resulted from the natural use of animal magnetism, not religious exorcism. Mesmer's novel approach was to try to put such cures and theorizing on a scientific basis. He attempted to convince medical establishments, first in Vienna and later in Paris, that his cures were genuine and that animal magnetism was real. Over and over again, physicians admitted that Mesmer had seemingly effected great cures, but they found his methods too bizarre, his theory unscientific. Some even intimated that he was a fraud. Mesmerism was too close to the occult, using trances, magical passes, and the trappings of these seances to satisfy Newtonian doctors. Mesmer was eventually worn down by these repeated rebuffs and by what he felt were betrayals by some of his followers. In 1784, he left Paris to live the rest of his life detached from the movement he had started. That movement was enormously popular. In the years before the French Revolution, it garnered far more attention from the French public than the issues of the Revolution. Mesmeric lodges sprang up all over France in the 1780s. Mesmer enlisted the Marquis de Lafayette as a patron and corresponded briefly with George Washington. Mesmer and mesmerism seemed to fill perfectly a gap left by religion's receding influence. Science was all the rage in the late 18th century, and its influence grew in the 19th century. People were hungry for a new set of certainties to replace the old. Mesmer offered at least the trappings of science, a reasoned theory about why his cures worked, an explanation that also covered the ancient miracle workers. Yet at the same time, Mesmer's practice, served up in mystical and magical dress, was more allowing than the austere rationalism of Newton's science. In short, Mesmer offered exactly the right pseudoscience for the times. It was scientific enough to appeal to the new rationalism, but spiritual enough to appeal to latent religious needs as well. And finally, to the conclusion of chapter 6, reason and its discontents. The major theme of the period between 1600 and 1800 was the triumph of science, in particular Newtonian science, over the old medieval theological worldview. In the 17th century, Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, and Newton demonstrated the power of a new kind of understanding of nature. The new scientific view substituted the idea of universal mathematical order for the older idea of universal meaning in nature. Humanity's view of nature changed greatly. Nature had been a book of signs revealing the invisible world beyond. Now it became an indifferent machine that could be known only in a limited way, via mathematics. Nature lost its meaningfulness, but humanity gained power over it from mathematically precise predictions. The viewpoint of science was something fundamentally new in human history. Heretofore, thinkers had merely speculated about the nature of reality, and their speculations were comprehensive in scope, but lacking in detail. Newtonian science substituted detailed analysis of concrete cases for vast speculations about cosmic order. Since Newton's time, of course, science has grown in comprehensiveness. Until, for many, it has entirely supplanted religion as a world picture. No sooner had Newton propounded the new anti-metaphysical science of physics than philosophers began to see the possibility of extending it to human nature. The enterprise began with Locke and occupied almost every 18th century thinker. The keynote was sounded by Hume in his call for a science of human nature to be as fundamental to science as metaphysics have been thought to be. It has emerged that natural science can get along quite well without psychology, and the average physicist would laugh at Hume's proposal. Still, the 18th century did move significantly toward creating a science of human nature. The philosophers believed in Hume's science, but they showed no more unanimity on the nature of human nature than psychologists show today. Alexander Pope, born 1688 and died in 1744, the English poet, caught the spirit of the Enlightenment view of human nature before the French Revolution. Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man, placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great, with too much knowledge for the sceptic side, with too much weakness for the stoic's pride. He hangs between, in doubt to act or rest, in doubt to deem himself a god or beast, in doubt his mind or body to prefer, born but to die, and reasoning but to err. Alike in ignorance, his reason such, whether he thinks too little or too much, chaos of thought and passion all confused, still by himself abused or disabused, created half to rise and half to fall, great Lord of all things, yet a prey to all, sole judge of truth, in endless error hurled, the glory, jest, and riddle of the world. Go, wondrous creature, mount where science guides. Go measure earth, weigh air, and state the rides. Instruct the planets in what orbs to run. Correct old time and regulate the sun. Go soar with Plato to the empirical sphere, to the first good, first perfect, and first fair. Or tread the maze round his fellows trod, and quitting sense, call imitating God, as Eastern priests in giddy circles run, and turn their heads to imitate the sun. Go teach eternal wisdom how to rule, then drop into thyself and be a fool. And that is the end of chapter 6 on the Enlightenment. Very fascinating stuff right there. We're going to continue with chapter 7 tomorrow, the ascent of science from 1815 to 1914. I'm going to read chapter 7. Not sure exactly how many pages chapter 7 is. Chapter 7 is the last part of part 3, and that is 191 to 219. So that's about 30 pages or so. So what I think we might do is break that down into two parts, 15 pages, chapter 7 for the first part, 15 for the second part. That's probably what we will do. Hopefully you enjoyed this live stream. Hopefully you found it educational and enlightening. I sure did. There's a lot that I got to reflect on. I always listen to these things again to gain more insight. It's very helpful. And I hope you do the same thing too. Y'all be easy out there, and peace.